What I was going to do today is first tell you all a little bit about the center and the work that we do, and then introduce our esteemed speaker, Dr. Rieder, who's from Johns Hopkins University. So first on our center. Our center is one of the leading pain research centers in the country. We are almost entirely focused on translational research, and what that means really is that we take that information and develop therapeutics that can hopefully help people that struggle with lots of different types of pain. So my lab primarily focuses on neuropathic pain. We have a number of people that work in my lab that are here. We also have posters outside, which I'd encourage you. I know a lot of you have already seen some of the posters, but after the talk, you can learn more about the posters. So my lab primarily works on neuropathic pain. We have Greg Dussor, who is one of the co-founders. Greg, maybe you can stand up briefly. Greg Dussor is one of the co-founders of the center. His lab works on migraine. And then we have Ben Kolber, who's right here. Ben's lab primarily works on visceral pain and also on amygdala plasticity and pain. And then our newest faculty member, Kate Sadler, who's right here. Kate's lab works on sickle cell pain and also microbiome and pain. We have one other faculty member who's not here. He's actually in Switzerland giving a talk. His name is Michael Burton. He is one of the co-founders along with Greg and I, and he is primarily working on neuroimmune interactions in pain. I also want to thank our dean, Steve Small, who's here. So Steve, maybe you can stand up also very briefly. Steve has been he's been a terrific supporter of our centers. Thank you, Dean Small, also for supporting our work. So I have the great pleasure now of introducing our speaker and the reason that we're all here today, Dr. Travis Rieder. Travis did his PhD in philosophy at Georgetown University. His work at the time is mostly around climate change and ethics. He, however, had a major life-changing accident that he's going to tell you about in his talk today that led him to do work on pain and opioids and the ethics of pain treatment and opioids and addiction. He's written this really terrific book, which I'd encourage all of you to either get the book or do like I did, get the audiobook and listen to him read it. The audiobook is really terrific. He also has an amazing voice. It's kind of surprising he's not in radio. His work has led him to be involved in lots of national panels. He does work with the NIH and the CDC, so he's really, not only written this book on the topic, but also thrown himself into policy at the highest level in the country and is doing an amazing job on that. He's a professor at Johns Hopkins in the Department of Bioethics, and we're really thrilled to have him here. So, Dr. Rieder, come on up.
Thank you, Ted. So, we're going to start today, May 23rd, 2015. This was supposed to be a very good day. 1.5-year-old baby girl didn't get out very much, and I negotiated the day away to go for a motorcycle ride with my dear friend Nathan. So the goal was this: Skyline Drive, one of my favorite rides down in Shenandoah. That is not how the day ended. About 3 blocks from my house, just kind of warming up, squeaking around in my leathers and body armor, and I saw a guy in a white van coming out of a housing addition. And I was alerted a little bit because he was still rolling as he came up to the stop sign. And so I started to panic and look for exits. That's just all the time it takes. Half a second, covered the distance, he blew through the stop sign, hit me on the left side, and my foot was pinched for just a split second between the bumper of the van and the fairing of my motorcycle. Crunch, I get thrown off the bike, it goes sliding, I go sliding down the road, my helmet hits the ground, come to a stop, and I think, okay, It's over, the noise stops. Think about my head, because I heard that helmet crack, right? I'm like, okay, helmet seems to have done its job. I'm still all in one piece. And then the second is over and my foot is on fire. And this is what happened to it. So about an hour later, get to the trauma bay, they do this x-ray. Now, I don't know if anyone in here is a radiologist, but just in case, that's not what a foot is actually supposed to look like. So the second and third metatarsals, the second and third toe, the bone that connect the toes, actually broke clean through, and so you can kind of see them shifted, and they came up through the top of the foot. But the real damage was to the big toe. So the first metatarsal that connects the big toe, the big toe kind of shears off a big piece of bone, and then that first metatarsal just shattered. And the bone pieces turn into shrapnel. And so the force of this impact inside the armored boot had nowhere to go, and the bone shards just blew out a hole through the inside of my foot. So I pull off my boot, screaming pain, and could see muscle, tendon, could see bone shards. If you get easily grossed out, I'm almost done with that part, I promise. So the reason that I give you the details of the accident is because I'd never had a medical trauma before. I'd been hurt, I played sports, I had broken bones, I had cuts, I had stitches and staples. I didn't know that there's a difference between like an injury and a trauma, right? And so I'd forgotten about this, and one of the folks I was talking to last night reminded me that in the book I say, you know, I was laying on the ground wondering, oh man, am I gonna miss my Memorial Day cookout the next day? Yes, the answer was, I was definitely going to miss the cookout the next day. So I was in what's called a limb salvage situation. And a limb salvage situation is the immediate threat is amputation. The foot, the flesh is dying. There's been so much damage. It's unclear whether you can pull the bones back together. And so I go to the nearest trauma bay, and there's the decision point. Do you amputate the foot or do you try to rebuild it? And so they tried to rebuild it. At the time, I was very grateful for this, because amputation sounds terrifying. Whenever I'm like up on stage like this, I feel like, spoiler alert, right? Because this is all me, this is real. So spoiler alert, I got to keep my foot. Miracle of modern medicine. I'll tell you a little bit about how it went. But the thing is, when you embark on reconstruction, there's a cost. And that cost is you're going to be in the hospital for a while. You're going to have a lot of surgeries. And so for me, it turned out that I had a total of 6 surgeries. The first 5 were limb salvage, like the success of keeping my limb depended on the success of those surgeries. The 6th one would come months later to make my foot look rather foot-shaped, which it did not at the beginning. So these first 5 surgeries were going to spread out over a month. First 3 of them were by an orthopedic surgeon. So his job as orthopedic trauma surgeon is to take all those bone shards, pull them together, and hope that they start to stitch into bone again. So as he described it to me, we're going to rebuild the pole that holds up the tent of your foot, right? That's the first 3 surgeries. He was really impressed at how well it went. He was not at all sure that he was going to be able to succeed, that the foot was going to survive. But he finished and he's like, it went pretty well. You're now in the hands of plastics. And this is a thing that if you've never had a sort of traumatic injury before, maybe you're as kind of naive as I was, it had never occurred to me that there's a medical problem if you have a hole in your body, which I know sounds a little obvious, right? But most of my injury experience was with like cuts, and you close it, right? Because the skin gets cut open and then you stitch the same amount of tissue back together. So when you have a cut, you can stitch it, you can staple it, you can close the wound. If you blow a hole out through the inside of your foot, you just lose a bunch of tissue. How do you fix that? You don't have enough tissue anymore. So it turns out, obviously, there's ways to do this, which I didn't know because I'm not an MD. So the first plan was skin graft. They were going to take a big piece of skin from my forearm and stretch it across the foot and hope that that grew enough to sort of protect the point of injury. I look back at the pictures now, which I will not show you a picture of the actual foot. I would do that to you. When I go to medical conferences, sometimes they want to see, because doctors are kind of like vampires. But normal people don't want to see that. So I look back at these pictures sometimes, and I think, how did they think a skin graft was going to work? And so I would eventually develop relationships with people at Hopkins. A good friend of mine is an orthopedic surgeon, and she's like, there's no way that was ever going to work. It was exposed bone, weight-bearing area. Like if they had succeeded at a skin graft, you would have been handicapped for the rest of your life. So they didn't succeed. I went in for surgery number 4, went under, woke up a few hours later, said, did it work? And they said, no, I'm sorry, it didn't work. Every surgery I went into, they had to cut away more necrotic tissue, more dead tissue, and the hole gets bigger. And so they say the skin just can't cover this wound. So I still have a problem. I still have a hole in my body. Turns out the solution to this sort of problem is something called a free flap, which is, as far as I can tell, magic. What the plastic surgeon that I had called his mentor, who's a world-class free flap surgeon, and she had an institute nearby. She agreed to take me on as a patient, and what a free flap is you cut free some tissue from one part of your body and transplant it to another part. And so for me, what that meant is they made an incision from about my knee to my hip on my left leg, and they took muscle and fat, so plug the hole, I'm pretty sure that's the medical terminology, plug the hole in the foot, muscle and fat, you take skin to cover it, but this is a lot of tissue, so it actually needs its own blood supply. So they clipped an artery out of the thigh, so they had a separate team come through, and they clipped an artery out, microsurgically transplanted that into the foot's existing infrastructure, so it's got its own blood supply. They thought I might want to feel something on my foot someday, which I didn't actually want to, but it turns out you need to know if you step on a nail or step on something hot, and so they had a nerve team come through also and clip out a nerve from my thigh and microsurgically transplant that into my foot. So this was the solution to the hole in my body. Absolutely amazing. It's about 8.5-hour surgery, and it worked. I came out of that surgery, spent 5 days in the ICU while they diligently every hour checked to make sure that the flap wasn't dying. 5 days in, they said, okay, you can move to the floor. Another 5 days on the floor where they can now check every 3 or 4 hours. Flap's not dying. And then I finally get to go home. 5 weeks after the accident. I'd been in and out of my house between surgeries, between hospitalizations, but now it's go home. And the reason that all of these details are relevant for our conversation today is because all of that surgery is trauma. Every time someone cuts into you, that's trauma. And so every surgery was a new, intensely, acutely painful experience. And then the 5th surgery is this free flap experience where they're not only rebuilding my foot, but now they've created a new trauma site on my leg. What this means is I was in excruciating pain for weeks on end. This was always going to happen. It's the cost of a reconstruction like this, right? And what that means is I was on all the meds, like all of them. I'm pretty sure all of them in the hospital. So the opioids were IV, morphine, fentanyl, hydromorphone, which you might know as Dilaudid, is the brand name. In between the IV, which is the real kind of heavy hitters, goes in your arm. You feel it seconds later, straight to your central nervous system. In between those, which you can do about every 4 hours, take IV oxycodone. Twice a day, you can take the extended release version of oxycodone, which is called OxyContin. And then because they clipped this nerve out of my leg, I had this terrible burning, fiery, electric pain that the opioids didn't treat very well. So they added something called gabapentin, which the thinking is that is better at neuropathic pain, that sometimes opioids don't help very well. So all of this medication, and the thing is when you're on this medication constantly, you sort of bathe the brain in it and you don't give it a chance to recover. Your brain is this fantastic learning machine. It's always trying to establish homeostasis. It always wants to be in balance. And so if you never give it a chance to come back to its normal state, it starts to think, oh, this is the normal state now, right? So it adjusts to the environment that you've given it. And that's why we have tolerance, right? So you have tolerance to drug. You have to take more drug to get the same effect. It doesn't matter the effect. If you're looking for pain relief, analgesia, you need more drug to get analgesic effects. If you're looking for euphoria and you're taking heroin off the street, you have to take more to get the same effects, right? Tolerance works the same no matter what effect you're chasing. So tolerance, and then the related piece of that is dependence, which is to say if you stop too soon, you go into withdrawal. I didn't really know any of this. Like I knew it maybe some of the way that some of you know it. I mean, some of you know a lot because you're like brain sciences people, which I was not. But some of you wandered in here somehow, I don't know, welcome. And so maybe you know about what I knew prior to this, which is to say I was put on all these drugs that I didn't know anything about. Here's the crazy thing. No one told me anything. There was precisely one concern that all of my clinicians had every time the nurse came into my room. Can anybody guess? I'm just curious. Anybody know what the thing that they were actually concerned with was?
What's your pain level?
Oh, no, that's true. They did ask me that all the time. So they always did ask me my pain level, which is how they upped the dose when the tolerance kicked in. Yeah.
Restroom break?
Huh?
Bathroom break?
Related. Constipation. Yeah, so opioids are constipating, which is actually one of the treatments that they were developed for back in the turn of the 19th century, 20th century, into the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. So like, they're really good at sedating respiration, which is good for like cough and stuff. They're obviously really good analgesics, and they constipate you if you have terrible diarrheal disease, right? So opioids are terribly constipating, and it sounds like a little strange that that's a concern, but it can be so bad that it can cause an obstruction in your bowels and require emergent surgery. So all of my nurses were very concerned about my constipation levels. And that was it. Nothing about tolerance, dependence, addiction. The entire advice I got when I finally got to go home from the hospital was, don't get behind the pain. Get behind the pain, you have to take too many meds to catch up. So take your pills before you really need them. I'm a really good patient. Every 4 hours, watching the clock, pop the next Oxy. Every 6 hours, pop the next gabapentin. Every 12 hours, the OxyContin. And tolerance keeps kicking in, and so I keep taking a higher dose. My plastic surgeon is managing the prescriptions. He keeps increasing the dose because tolerance is kicking in. And it is 2 months after the accident that I finally go back to my orthopedic surgeon. He hasn't seen me in a long time, right? And he looks at my beautiful $500,000 foot that has been stitched back together from my thigh. And he's like, this is incredible. How you doing? What's your pain level like? Oh, it's not too bad. What are you taking for it? So my partner, Sadi, and I do the math, adding up the oxycodone, OxyContin, gabapentin, and we tell him this. I don't know if you know any surgeons, but they're like really busy and their time is worth a lot of money. So they do lots of things at the same time. They're like typing, talking, turning around. It's the only time I ever saw my orthopedic surgeon stop. I gave him the number, how many milligrams of Oxy I'm on, and he just stopped and he turned around and he said, that's just too much. How are you on that much? It's been too long, you should be off the meds by now. And that was the first time that anyone talked to me about the risks of opioids, of being on them long term. All right, so here's how the rest of this went. I said, okay, what do I do next? He said, well, you need to get off it. You can't just stop. You'll go into terrible withdrawal. You need a tapering plan. Okay, what's a tapering plan? And these were not his words, but I'm pretty sure what he said next was basically, ooh, that is not my problem. I hadn't seen him in a long time. He's like, I didn't write these prescriptions. Who's been writing for you? I said, well, the plastic surgeon has. And he said, go to the plastic surgeon, tell him you need a tapering plan. It's time for you to get off these. Okay, so I go to the plastic surgeon the very next day. I said, Dr. So-and-so says I need to get off these. I need a tapering plan. Tell me how to do it. And he did the thing where he looked for the answer in his eyelids. Do you know what I'm talking about? He's like, ah. And that should have been a clue that he did not know what he was talking about. So he gave me the following advice. He said, all right, let's take the gabapentin, the OxyContin, the IR oxycodone, let's take it all, divide it into 4. Tomorrow, drop a quarter of it. A week later, drop the next quarter. A week later, drop the next quarter. In a month, you'll be off. So 25% dose reduction a week, so you'll be off everything in a month. Okay. I'm always worried that people are going to walk out of the talk before the end and miss the punchlines. I'm going to give you the punchline right now. That was terrible advice. If you wanted to systematically torture your worst enemy, get them physically dependent on opioids and then taper them according to that plan. And the reason I say that is because if somebody is physically dependent on opioids and they're going to face withdrawal, a 25% dose reduction is enough that it will launch them into acute withdrawal. They are going to be miserable. But it's still only 25%, which means they're going to have to do it 3 more times. So if you follow that plan, you're going to launch yourself into misery and you're going to stay there for a month. And that's what happened to me. So this graphic was drawn by an artist when I published my very first piece on the experience I'm about to tell you about. That was all prologue, kind of crazy, right? I'm not going to talk to you about the trauma and the bones sticking out of the feet. I'm going to talk to you about what came next. So I eventually wrote about this experience quite a bit later. This came out January 2017. And I wrote for the journal Health Affairs. And what I did is I shared a little bit of my experience, and then I gave a few sort of ethics and policy implications that I thought doctors should be aware of. And when the proofs came back from the publisher and they said, this is what the artist came up with, do you approve the image? I about threw up because they understood. The artist had read the piece and they got what withdrawal was like. Because it's like putting yourself in a vice and somebody's just gonna twist it a little bit each day. And every day is gonna be worse than the last, and you're pretty sure it's gonna kill you. But you don't know how long it's gonna take. And that's what opioid withdrawal is like. So one of the reasons that I wrote this piece is because I had only ever heard the following about opioids, because I learned them from The Wire and like movies and books. So apparently opioid withdrawal is like you throw up, you shake, you sweat, and then cutscene, thank God you're better the next day. Thank goodness he kicked the bucket, right? That's what withdrawal is like. That's what going cold turkey is like. And so I would start to talk to doctors, and they would say things like, well, we've been taught that benzo withdrawal can kill you, alcohol withdrawal can kill you. You have to be careful with those. Opioid withdrawal is uncomfortable. But uncomfortable like in a way that can make you wish you were dying and eventually make you think about taking that whole dying thing into your own hands. This is suicidal making misery. So doctors would say it's just like a bad case of the flu. So baseline about opioid withdrawal, here's the lesson. Baseline opioid withdrawal, the worst flu you can imagine times 1,000. That's beginning symptoms, right? Nausea, diarrhea, sweats, fever, internal thermostat going absolutely haywire. But here's the thing about drug withdrawal, and so this is a lesson that I learned much later when I started trying to figure this stuff out. Very often the symptoms that you get in withdrawal are the opposite of a drug's intended effects, right? So one of the first things that happens in withdrawal that I just don't hear people talk about is hyperalgesia, increased sensitivity to pain, because opioids are analgesics. They're making you feel better. So whatever you were medicating when you go into withdrawal, that is going to explode. But not only that thing that you were medicating, everything else, all of your joints, all of your muscles, all of your skin, they're all on fire all the time. So that's just to start. Opioids are also sedatives, right? They're respiratory depressants, they calm you down, they make you sleepy. So there's this weird hyperactivity that comes with withdrawal, and it's associated with that shaking and the sort of tremors that you get, but you feel full of like electric energy that has to release, and so you jitter and you shake and you kick your arms and legs. And not only is it really, really nasty to experience, but it keeps you awake. You can't rest. So remember the flu times 1,000 and all the pain? You're not getting any reprieve from it because you can't sleep. And then insomnia is just like nightmarish because there is no escape from your misery. Also, of course, opioids are euphoric, famously, right? And so what I totally wasn't prepared for is that the withdrawal from opioids would be dysphoric. And so I have never had depression before. I've had lots of problems. This just happens to not be one of them. And I didn't understand what depression felt like. And so what I thought was happening is that I just was having like clarity about my situation inside my own head. Oh, I know what's happening now. My life isn't worth living anymore. So not only was I miserable and that felt true, but I was depressed. And it got worse and worse. So here is the short version of the rest of the story. Remember that whole you have to like step down again each week? Every week we tried to find someone to help me, and we just couldn't. So my partner, Sadia, she's a PhD scientist. She's trying to figure out herself. She's on PubMed every day, Googling for solutions. She finds something on this drug, buprenorphine, that we've never heard of at the time. We're going to talk about later. But I've never heard about it at the time. We're like, hey, take it to the prescribing doctor. This drug, buprenorphine, it looks like there's an evidence base that can help with withdrawal. Is that something that he could use? And the prescribing doctor was like, whoa, I'm a plastic surgeon. I am not prescribing him buprenorphine, which it turns out is an addiction medicine primarily. So it probably isn't what I needed. But we were just like doing our best. And so here's the only advice that we get anyone to give us. My prescribing doctor is like, he sounds really bad. This is scary. If it gets worse, go to the ER. go back on the meds until he stabilizes. And I said, go back on the meds, what then? It's like, try again when he's feeling stronger. So here's the one thing that I believed. I believed that if I ever stopped the tapering process, I would never be able to make myself do it again, because it was absolute misery and I'm not that strong. And so if I rescued myself, I'd just take opioids now. That's my life. And so every week I had to decide, well, no one's helping us. Do I stick with the plan and drop it again? Or do I just decide that I use opioids now? So every week I tried. I dropped it again. And here is nature's sick joke of tapering. Remember I said brains are learning machines? Are we trying to reestablish homeostasis? What I didn't know at the time is that a week is about long enough that my brain is starting to reestablish homeostasis. And so I dropped that first bit, and now it's getting accustomed to the new reduced dose. But I was going to drop 25% from that starting dose each week. So now let's just use some simple math, not my actual MMEs. So imagine I was on 100 milligrams of morphine. That first week I dropped 25 milligrams of morphine, 25% dose reduction. But now the next week my brain is used to 75 milligrams. So when I drop 25 milligrams again, I drop 33%. And the next week I dropped 25 from 50, and now I've dropped 50%. And eventually I have to go to nothing from something, and I have to drop 100%. And the severity of opioid withdrawal symptoms is not associated with the raw milligram numbers, it's associated with the percentage dose reduction. So every week gets worse. So right as you start to think, like, maybe I'll make it, I'm halfway through, maybe I'll make it, I'm 3/4 of the way through, every time the misery ratchets up a little bit more. So here's how the story ends. I have gotten to the final dose drop. I take that drop, I'm on no medication, and I try to vomit for 4 days straight. But I haven't eaten anything in days because I'm nauseous all the time. So all I'm doing is just like tearing my stomach muscles apart. And I haven't slept. So I go 3 nights with 0 sleep, but I also can't walk because I've had a blown apart foot. And I'm afraid of having to run to the restroom. And so I spend a night on the bathroom floor, just like laying face down because the tiles are cold and I've got a raging fever. Every 30 or 40 minutes getting up and trying to vomit. And I just cry all night. And Sadie wakes up in the morning and she comes down, I call for her, and she's terrified when she sees me. And she says, I think it's time to go back on the meds. I said, me too. So we call a prescribing doc. He's grateful because he's been in the loop this whole time. He keeps telling me to go back on the meds. He prescribes me a big bottle. We ask him for 5 milligram oxytabs. I had 20 before. So this way we could do a smaller dose increase. And I make a plan that night. I'm actually going to go to bed, which I haven't done in weeks. And I put this bottle of pills on my nightstand, a glass of water. And my plan is, like, I'm real stubborn. And so it feels really terrible to just like lay down, take a bunch of pills and try to go to sleep. And so I'm like, no, I can't just like give up. I have to suffer a little bit more first. And so I lay down at about 10 o'clock at night, and I'm like, at 2 a.m., if I'm still awake, I'm gonna take 1 pill. And at 3 a.m., if I'm still awake, I'm gonna take 1 more. And at 4 a.m., if I'm still awake, I'm gonna take 1 more. And I'm gonna do that until I sleep. And that's my new starting dose. And then I just fell asleep. I just fell asleep before I took any of them. And the reason I fell asleep is because it was day 29. And so remember I said that process takes about a week before you start to normalize. I was just really close to getting some relief. So I fell asleep, I slept for about 6 hours, and I woke up and Sadia's just watching me, like, you're like scared to move. And she said, how do you feel? I feel pretty good, which was like a lie, but it was a relative good, right? It was like, I don't want to die right now. And at that point, I knew that I would make it out the rest of the detox, and that's what I did. Okay, that's the hard part of the talk done. Now we're going to talk some ethics and science. Okay. Here's the thing. I'm a professor. I'm a bioethicist. I just got a fancy new faculty position that I was like signing on to from my house with an exploded foot. But I'm really excited to research and I don't know anything about what just happened to me. So I slowly start sharing details about this experience, which, take a note here, right? I've just gone through 4 weeks of absolute misery and no one knew. Sadia, myself, and our baby daughter, she wasn't talking, right? So like the three of us at home, only people who know I'm going through this. I work at Hopkins, all of my friends are clinicians. Like they've seen x-rays of my exploded foot. I've gotten, second opinions on every surgery. Everyone knows about everything and no one knew about this. We kept it this little secret, which is weird, right? But it's drugs, it's opioids, it's withdrawal, it feels terrible. And so we didn't talk about it. Finally gained a little distance, and as I get better and I start to eat and I start to stabilize, then I start to get angry. And then I start to get curious. And so we finally tell one of my friends, who's very sweet, the kind of good friend that can actually say this to someone. He's like, hey, Travis, you're a bioethicist. Think you might have anything to say about what happened to you? Like maybe anything that you could do with your career? And I thought the answer was no, because I thought what happened to me was like unique. It was a mistake. So this was the question that started to like haunt me. Were there any generalizable lessons from my experience? And the thing that a couple of my colleagues raised as I started sharing this that made me think that there might be some generalizable lessons is that I have all of these privileges. My wife and I are both highly educated. I would work at a world-class medical institution. We have access to people. We live in the Washington, D.C. area, where, remember, doctors put my foot back together with my thigh. Like, we have access to, under some description, incredible medical care and expertise. And now let's take some of the less tangible but very real cultural stuff. I'm one of the people who got all of the privileges when they were being handed out in society, right? I'm a guy, I'm white, I'm middle class. If there's anyone that you should expect to have their testimony taken seriously, to feel entitled enough to get care, someone who looks about like me should have been able to figure this out. So here was the thought that made me think, oh, this is a real problem. One of my colleagues said, if you couldn't get through this, how is anyone else doing it? And that's what made me think this wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't a one-off. So that first piece that the graphic artist came up with that picture for, one of the notes that I made is no one should get as unlucky as I did. So if I'm unlucky, if this was a mistake, this definitely shouldn't have happened to anyone. But also there's a bunch of sort of informal reasons for thinking we obviously don't have data on people who fall through the cracks because they fell through the cracks, right? But there's real good reason to think that there are a bunch of people who are falling through these cracks. So the rest of this paragraph has the most uncontroversial claim I've ever argued for in my entire career as an ethicist, which is that a physician has a duty to prescribe only those medications that he or she can responsibly manage for the length of a patient's need, including the treatment of foreseeable side effects. So if withdrawal is a foreseeable side effect of opioids, it might be nice if people who prescribe opioids actually knew how to manage withdrawal, right? And somehow this seems to have gone missed somewhere along the way. So I started thinking about this, and my first thought was, clinicians somehow let this happen to me. And to be clear, this is not an individual clinician problem. This is not, so in my book, I never name any clinicians. I make up pseudonyms for the hospitals, for the clinicians, because this isn't about them. This is structural problem, right? People aren't getting taught important things. We call dozens of doctors in the Washington, D.C., Baltimore area, and they would say to me, we don't know how to taper opioids. How is that possible? So first my thought was, this is being let happen by cracks, gaping chasms in the healthcare system. But then I realized, the more I talked to people and the more I thought about it, that there's actually sometimes where it's worse than that. Sometimes we're actually pushing people into trouble with their opioids. So this is a different a different population of patients that look a little different than I did. All right, so the first guy to pop up here, this is Dr. Stefan Kertész. He's He's an amazing guy. He works at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. He's in the VA hospital there. And this was a write-up in Stat. And the reason he's being written up is because he is trying to figure out what happened to this population of patients that we prescribed opioids to really aggressively for years. Because in America, we thought opioids were a safe and effective treatment for all sorts of pain for 20 years. And now we've gotten a little bit scared of them because, all the death and destruction. But what's happening to all these patients? So remember that thing about tolerance, how you need more and more of a dose of a medication to get the same effect? I've met patients now who got first prescribed opioids for chronic pain in 1996. They're still on it now. They've had to keep titrating the dose up. So let's get some numbers. So the CDC says try not to titrate patients up past 50 morphine milligram equivalents. So we translate everything into morphine to make the numbers easy. So morphine milligram equivalents, try not to titrate up past 50. You can have good reason for titrating past 50. I was probably always going to need more than 50 because I was having surgery for so long. So then they say, well, once you get to 90, check again. Going up past 90 is starting to be a real sort of risky area. So these numbers came about through their data review because these seem to be where overdose from opioids seem to increase pretty dramatically. So they said 50 is sort of risk area, 90 gets more serious. When I titrated down, when I was given my taper 2 months after the accident, I was on 200 MMEs, 200 morphine milligram equivalents. So more than twice the sort of upper limit the CDC recommends. I've now met patients who got started in the 90s, early 2000s, around 1,600 MMEs, 2,000. The record is held by a very sweet man I met in Cleveland, Ohio, who was on 2,700 morphine milligram equivalents. Which, to be clear, I don't know everyone's medical record in here, but most of us would just kill us outright, right? But the tolerance is protective, right? He needed more of the dose. So Stefan got interested in these patients because as we became afraid of opioids, the medical community started trying to get patients off of them. And now this sweet man in Cleveland, Ohio, who wants to write a prescription for 2,700 MMEs when the CDC has said don't go past 90? Nobody wants to write that prescription. So he's trying to track these people because sometimes doctors are saying, I'm done. You taper or you're out of my office. And of course, these patients are terrified because remember the thing about withdrawal that I just gave you like a 20-minute talk on? Everyone who's been on opioids for 20 years has missed a dose, has been traveling and forgotten their meds. They've all experienced withdrawal and they know that it is catastrophic. So when you tell them they have to go off the meds, fire alarms going off in their head. So now the New England Journal of Medicine published this piece. The lead author, Debbie Dow, was also the lead author of the CDC guidelines, the 50, 90 milligram thing, right? And so she and her colleagues said, we actually have to come out and talk about this because people were taking those CDC guidelines and then taking them out of context, saying, oh, well, the CDC said 50 or 90, that means no one can be above it. You're on 2,700 MMEs, you have to get down to 90 now. Which is not what any of that it was about. That was about titrating up, right? You get a new trauma patient, you try really hard not to titrate them up. You use the littlest amount that you can for the least amount of time. And so the CDC authors wrote this piece and said there are no shortcuts. You can't just force your patients off. You can't abandon them because they were getting reports. The FDA issued an official report saying, doctors, don't force your patients off opioids because there are suicides being reported. People going into catastrophic pain, remember, hyperalgesia, symptom of withdrawal? So these people are on opioids for chronic pain. They've had their spinal cord destroyed or something. And then when they go off opioids, they've got this just devastating hyperalgesia, which is just going to be part of withdrawal. So this has become a big problem, and it's way more complicated than my case. 2 months, 200 MMEs. Some of these people, 25 years, thousands of MMEs. But they share a common piece, right? They share a piece that has to do with this property of opioids that they cause physical dependence. Okay, so now I've been using this language for the whole talk, physical dependence. Let's get clear on what this means. It's real complicated because for a long time, psychiatrists actually use dependence and addiction to mean the same thing. So you go back far enough in the DSM and you'll find dependence is just a synonym for addiction. We now use it to distinguish between physiological dependence, which I'm going to define, and addiction. Physiological dependence is just a thing that happens to brains and bodies. And addiction is a behavioral disorder, right? So I'm going to cash this out for you. A lot of people get suspicious when I start talking about this. I am convinced that in 5 minutes, I can convert you all to understanding that dependence and addiction are just very different things. So here we go. So physical dependence is just what you have if you will experience withdrawal following abrupt discontinuation or too fast of a taper. So this is to say that your learning machine inside your skull has gotten accustomed to a new normal, and you rip it out from under them, and your brain is not happy, right? Brain scientists in here are like, Jesus Christ, this guy's butchering it. Sorry, it's normal speak. This is just how brains work. This is not an anomaly. It's not like, oh, people who have certain problems are going to experience withdrawal. If every single one of us got put on an around-the-clock morphine drip and a high enough dose for the next 3 weeks, 100% of us would go into withdrawal if it was discontinued. Maybe there's like a genetic anomaly that I don't know about and there'd be an exception or something, but generalizing, every single one of us would get violently ill if you were on a morphine drip around the clock for the next 3 weeks and it was just taken away. It's just how brains work. We know this. We know this about opioids and lots of other drugs too. We'll talk about in a minute. Whoop, I did a thing. There we go. Addiction, on the other hand, is this behavioral disorder. So it's actually a psychosocial biological phenomenon, right? But it's about someone's behavior. So it involves cravings, which notice this is not a biological description. This is a psychological description. It's a feeling. So craving is really hard to define. Philosophers of addiction are working on it. But a craving is like a really sort of desperate wanting, the sort of wanting that is hard to resist. Sometimes it gets talked about in coordination with compulsion. Compulsion is dangerous because people with addiction aren't robots, right? They can make choices, and they do. They make choices to use drugs more safely. If you don't think people with addiction can make choices, try to convince them to buy drugs from a cop. They won't buy drugs from a cop, right? They can make a choice, even if they really want a drug. If they're like, oh, that guy's trying to sell me drugs as a cop, they will not buy drugs from that cop, right? You can make choices, so people are not just compelled. But compulsion is used to talk about cravings as incredibly powerful. Here's the big one. Addiction involves continued use despite negative consequences. So the paradigm addiction stories are the burning your life down, right? You lose your house, you lose your spouse, you lose access to your kids, you lose your job, maybe you end up on the street. From the outside, it looks completely irrational that anyone would keep using drugs as they lose all of these things. They continue to use despite negative consequences, which is this puzzle of addiction, my colleague Hannah Pickard calls it. And this occurs in a vast minority of those exposed to a drug. Don't know exactly how many, depends on the drug. Different drugs have different what's called addiction liability. But in opioids, we think it's somewhere between like 1 and 11%. If you're exposed to opioids, especially over a prolonged time, you have somewhere between like a 1 and 11% of developing a use disorder or an addiction. Now, that's a vast minority, but also be clear, if it were closer to that 10% range, we expose millions and millions and millions of people to opioids, right? So even a small percentage is a big deal. But what I'm pointing out is that everyone gets dependent. Very few people get addicted. If you're still suspicious, you're like, I'm not convinced. I can show you that they come apart. We have behaviors that are dependence causing and not addiction forming, and behaviors that are addiction forming and not dependence causing, and then the really nasty stuff in the middle. So, will cause dependence, but no addiction liability. A bunch of the psych meds we use, anti-seizure meds, but also real common stuff like SSRIs. In this room, there are people in here on Prozac or Lexapro, like these are just used all the time. If you're on Lexapro or Prozac and you've missed your dose, you've experienced some nasty withdrawal effects. Nobody is addicted to Lexapro. There is no addiction to Lexapro. Lexapro has no street value. You can't buy it from a drug dealer because it's not euphoric. The euphoric aspects of the drugs give it street value because it's what people want, and it's what involves the reward system that starts to develop the habit that becomes an addiction. So we have a bunch of meds that cause withdrawal. They are dependence causing. They have no addiction liability. We also have these behaviors that we're pretty sure are addictive now. This one's slightly more controversial because different people have different views of addiction, but I think gambling is like pretty darn uncontroversial that there's such a thing as gambling addiction. Gambling doesn't cause dependence, not in the same way. Because dependence is when you exogenously introduce, so exogenously from outside of the body, a new amount of drug that the central nervous system has to become accustomed to. But what gambling does is it rewards you for a certain behavior using only your endogenous system, right? So you can develop that addiction through your reward system But you're not going to go through catastrophic withdrawal if you get cut off from gambling. You will hate people if they're keeping you from gambling and you have an addiction to it, but you're not going to vomit and diarrhea, right? That's not part of it. And then there's the really nasty stuff in the middle. And this is part of what makes it so hard to get off the drugs that are both dependence causing and have addiction risk. Opioids are a paradigm case because their withdrawal syndrome is so catastrophic that that's a negative reinforcer to go back on the drug. I wanted to go back on the drug just to rescue myself. And I thought if I rescued myself, I'd never be able to taper again, right? But then they're also euphoric. And so if you really enjoy them, you want to do them. You have the cravings as well. And that's engaging the reward systems. You have positive and negative reinforcers, which make these drugs particularly risky. That's why dependence and addiction are separated. So what's that lesson mean? We run them together all the time. And so people see the symptoms of dependence. They think addiction. We stigmatize the heck out of addiction. And so then we avoid people with dependence. Now, to be clear, we just shouldn't stigmatize addiction. We shouldn't avoid anybody who's using drugs and having a problem with it. But what happened in my care is no one wanted to talk to me because I'm a sweaty, shaky mess, crying and sobbing and saying, I can't get off opioids. And so a bunch of doctors are like, get out of my office. Not exactly, I was calling, but you get it. You get the idea. So whose job is it to take care of like routine withdrawal care, to deal with dependence? I would have thought it was my prescribing physician, which I did think, and I called him, and he's like, go back on the meds, which is not the helpful advice I was looking for, to get off the meds. And so eventually when I got real sick, he said, why don't you go to pain medicine? I'd had a pain team in hospital, so I called pain medicine. They wouldn't talk to me. Finally, I got a nurse on the phone. She said, we're sobbing and yelling and saying, no one will let us talk to pain medicine. We're in trouble. They put me on these meds. And so she said, look, if you just wait, it's going to be a while. I will run around the hospital, find the attending, and report back to you. She did. She kept her word. She ran around the hospital. She found the attending, the lead of the pain team. She came back and said, they're not going to talk to you. They said to tell you that they're an inpatient pain team. They get control of pain. They don't manage tapering or withdrawal. And my head exploded. It's like, oh, good. You only put people on the risky drugs. You don't take them off. Excellent. Good job. Whose job am I then? And she said, I think you should probably try addiction medicine. I had internalized this dependence-addiction distinction without ever having given it much thought. So it had never occurred to me that I might be dealing with addiction. I had a house full of pills I wasn't taking. I was just trying to get off of them. But she said addiction medicine might help, so I started calling addiction clinics. Called all of them. And they'd listen to my story and say, you know, that's not what we do here. So I have one in particular. It's the only one that I actually remember the conversation. You'll see why. It was just very striking. So I called this clinic. I didn't know anything. So it turns out that what I called was a methadone clinic. Now, a methadone clinic was not the right group of people to help me. They put people on methadone, which is a long-acting opioid. It's not what I wanted, right, or needed. But I didn't know. I just Googled rehabs, right? So I called this methadone clinic. The very sweet woman on the phone listened to my long, rambling, sobby story. And I got to the end, and I said, so can you help me? And she sighed. She said, oh, honey, you are not our problem. And I was just crying. I cried a lot at this time. Remember depression? So I was just crying, and I said, whose problem am I? And she said, I don't know, your prescriber? So remember, I was looking for generalizable lessons. Here are the ones that I got so far. Stopping a medication is morally different from starting it. We somehow licensed our clinicians in this country to start medications that they don't understand and can't control. And remember, that's not the individual clinician's problem. This is a structural problem. We don't teach them anything about this in medical school. I know, because now I teach in a medical school, right? This is not something that we handle. But stopping it is really hard, and the situation is different because you've introduced dependence and withdrawal, and probably a higher addiction risk at this point, right? It has to be somebody's job, because if it's not someone's job, I'm going to be in that tight little circle, remember, of handoffs to the next person. And that job might not be treating addiction. It might be. So some people with an addiction are going to have a dependence because they're taking opioids nearly around the clock, right? So addiction medicine might be the right people to handle the dependence and the addiction. But if you're not trying to treat addiction, and addiction medicine, this is the other thing that that sweet woman said to me on the phone. She said, look, we have a waiting list. And the people who are trying to get in here might die from laced heroin if they don't get into treatment. Like, they're a moment from overdose. Like, you're just sick because your doctors don't know what to do with the meds. Like, that's why you're not our problem, right? So this has to be something that is actually taken care of. But, it's 3:21, uh-oh. I'm gonna power through. I wanna leave you with what I think is a really important lesson, because when I started getting involved in this conversation, I thought, no wonder we have an opioid epidemic in this country, right? I started learning about what's happening with the way we treat opioids. And I'm like, everyone just threw these pills at me and they're like, you're on your own. And I was like, no wonder we have a crisis in this country. So in other words, I saw a very tight relationship between pharmaceutical opioids and the epidemic. And to be clear, there has been a tight relationship. So the modern era of the opioid epidemic was partially kicked off. So some of the authors that talk about this talk about it. Pharma is like a taproot of the modern drug overdose crisis. But what I want to show you here is the graph from the CDC that tells us about opioid-involved overdose. I know there's a lot of information, so I'm going to explain it to you. So this arrow points at the peak of drug overdose deaths from prescription opioids, oxycodone, prescribed fentanyl, hydromorphone, this sort of thing. That blue line that it's pointing to, the turquoise line, that drug overdose rate quadrupled between 1999 and that point in 2011. That was the instigator of the modern piece, the modern moment of drug overdose crisis. But what I want you to notice is that right around that 2010 to 2012 point, we did freak out about prescription opioids in this country. The CDC director at the time, Thomas Rieder, clamped down and told doctors to stop killing their patient. He didn't use those words, but he said, this moment has been instigated by doctors. Doctors can help fix it. And the sort of weaponizing of policymakers was pretty much like, hey, doctors, stop killing your patients by giving them this med, right? So we did start to curb the prescription opioid supply, and look what happened. Like, that was actually the peak of the overdose rate from prescription opioids for a while. So curbing the supply kind of tackled the opioid problem, but that top line is drug overdose or opioid overdose from any opioid. Illicit heroin, illicit fentanyl, right? That goes up and up and up. So we get a control on prescription opioid prescribing in 2010 to 2012, and we do not solve the opioid crisis. It gets worse by a lot. When I started working on this topic in 2015, I was getting the most recent data from the CDC available, and something like 40,000 people a year were dying from drug overdose. And that was taken to be catastrophic, on par with the number of people who died from auto accidents and from gun deaths, and compared with the total number of Americans who died in the Vietnam War. Absolutely an unacceptable number of people dying, these preventable deaths. The most recent year for which we have data, 107,000 people died from drug overdose. That's how much worse it's gotten in the meantime. What this means is reducing prescription opioids won't solve the opioid problem. It doesn't mean it's not a part of what's going on, but you go back to that map and you see when we cut supply to prescription opioids, we drove people to heroin. We lose access to regulated pharmaceutical grade opioids, which are gonna kill you if you have an addiction some of the time, but are easy to dose because they're regulated. You drive them to heroin and the overdose death starts to go up because it is laced, it is not regulated. And what it eventually gets laced with is fentanyl. Fentanyl and its chemical analogs, its chemical cousins, synthetic drugs that are 50 to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000 times more potent than morphine. That's what's in the drug supply now, and that's what's actually killing people. So like prescription opioids played a role. And like, obviously we owe pain patients good care regardless of the connection with the opioid crisis. But this idea that like we're gonna solve the opioid epidemic by solving the prescription problem doesn't take into account this, that we have 23.5 million people with substance use disorder living right now, and they are dying at an astronomical rate. So what will reduce overdose drug deaths? That's a kind of different topic, but now that I've said this, it would just be mean for me to not tell you a little bit, right? So here are the categories, sort of 4 pillars. Supply's one, right? So I just said solving the prescription problem will solve the epidemic. But like, it's part of it. There was a taproot, remember? There was Purdue Pharma and OxyContin and fentanyl and Subsys. Like, there was a problem with supply. Being responsible with pain care will play a role. And of course, there's another supply side too, which is illicit. It's drug cartels, it's the illicit fentanyl on the street. But since that's a really pretty small part, think about your economics language, supply and demand, right? It's not just about there being drugs, it's about why do people take drugs? And in particular, why do Americans take so many drugs? There was just a piece in the New York Times this week, I think came out May 3rd by Nicholas Kristof, on why Americans are in so much pain. And this is related because opioids are great painkillers, at least for a while. And it doesn't matter whether your pain is physical or emotional or psychic and traumatic. If you are miserable, opioids can make you feel better. So a lot of people who are in pain of some sort feel like they have a reason to take drugs. That's another side that we could address. How can we make people less miserable so that they don't need opioids? There's also this like crazy fact that we have a treatment gap in the United States for addiction of 90%. 9 out of 10 people who live with substance use disorder aren't getting specialty treatment. Imagine that for any other condition. Like imagine you get diagnosed with diabetes and you're like, sorry you have diabetes, but like only 10% of people are actually gonna get treatment for it. Like for some reason we just live with this for addiction. 90% of people not getting specialty treatment. And it's worse than that because with opioids, which is causing most of it right now, we have really good meds for it. We have medication-assisted treatment, or MOUD, and it reduces all-cause mortality by like 50%, which is the gold standard. And half or more of the specialty treatments for addiction in the country don't allow MOUD. So not only do we have this treatment gap, but a bunch of the people who get into treatment only get substandard care. They don't have access to the gold standard care. Last one's a little more controversial. Maybe you'll want to talk about this. If people don't want to go into addiction, if they don't want to go into addiction treatment, we need to keep them alive until they're ready. So here's this thing that said in the harm reduction movement. So this is representing harm reduction. Dead people don't recover. You have to keep them alive if you want to give people a chance to recover. So this is a picture from Insight in Vancouver, which was the first safe injection site in North America. These are now called safe consumption sites or overdose prevention sites. We opened the first 2 in the country in New York City.
Lost your microphone.
Oh my goodness. Well, I think the battery got here. All right, I'm almost done, so let's just do this. Testing, yeah. Okay. So we have safe injection sites, the first to open in New York City, right? We have 2. For a country of 23.5 million people living with substance use disorder. And we know these work. We know these work because they've been in 200 locations around the world for up to decades. Here's the thing about safe consumption site. They've witnessed tens of millions of drug use instances, and there's never been a single recorded overdose death in any safe consumption site. So we could keep people alive while they're using drugs if we wanted to, if we cared about it. So that's it. Prescription opioids are a big part of the problem in healthcare. But they're not a big part of the problem totally when it comes to the opioid epidemic. So we have lots of reasons to fix pain medicine, but it's not going to solve the opioid epidemic. We have to fix the drug addiction crisis, the overdose crisis anyway. I'm going to stop there. Thank you all very much. Thank you for having me. Happy to take questions.
So we do have a little bit of time for questions, and I'll run around with the microphone.
I think I could ask a million questions. The first thing is, since you are a bioethicist and you do participate in the Berman Institute, how much research should be done that is not being done? And as we look at your slide or your presentation over there, when we're talking about deaths and saying that it's not because of prescriptions, we are not talking about the thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that are on drugs and are dependent on them and making money for the organizations. And given that we have a broken healthcare system, not only does mental health not work, but the rest of it. And how do we get about teaching our physicians who are going to be offering these opioids what the result is and what the potential result is? So I'm going to stop there. I apologize for taking up such a long time.
No, I'll give just a couple thoughts and we can come back to it as much as other people want to. But Ted and Greg and I both had conversations independently about this education component first. Like, how do you actually fix the healthcare part with physicians? And on the one hand, obviously a bunch of physicians need to know how to taper. Now, my accident was in 2015. I've been talking about this now since 2017. There has been some improvement on this. I give talks like this for continuing medical education. You know, I have probably personally told, I don't know, a few thousand clinicians how to taper opioids. It's not that hard. I'm not an MD. I can teach you how to taper opioids, right? Like, the data's out there now. In my case, the case of the legacy patients is way harder, to be clear, but routine tapering is not that hard. I can teach it. Lots of people can teach it. Folks in addiction medicine can teach it. But it has to be rewarded by the healthcare system. So there are a couple places where this has to change. One is in schools of medicine and residency programs, right? If it's not showing up on the exams required to become a doctor, it's just not going to be taught. And so I've been lobbying for years. We have to do more pain care. At Johns Hopkins, we now have a pain course that we brag about, but it's a total of 15 hours. That is a good question. I think all M1 students take it, but it is possible that they could be exempted. I don't know if it's mandatory, but in general, I get all of the first year students at the end of their first year. And they learn about this. What's that? But it needs to be ongoing, right? And when they go into residency and they go into fellowship, their attendings need to know because their attendings don't know, right? And so it has to be CME, it has to be taught schools of medicine. Those things are not super incentivized, right? So the one last piece I'll say, and then we can let other people jump in and maybe come back to it. It takes time. It takes time to manage opioids the way they need to be managed. And right now there is nothing, so ICD-10 codes are the codes that are used for lots of reasons, but they help with reimbursement processes, right? So the doctor says ICD-10 code, whatever for bacterial infection, and then there's reimbursement tied to the time they spend with the patient. There's no ICD-10 code for patient with dependence. There's no ICD-10 code for I had to counsel a patient for 20 minutes, which is a long appointment for a lot of docs, because they're terrified of tapering, but I need them to taper, right? So these are complex, difficult topics that doctors may not get reimbursed for. And here's a recipe for disaster. Telling doctors that they have to do something, but they're not going to get paid for it, right? Like, this is a structural problem. We need to actually have a reimbursement sort of solution. So I'll stop there, because I'm just going to rant forever, but happy to take the next one.
Are there other questions for Travis? Yeah.
I guess one of the questions that I would ask is, are there any programs that you know of that are leading the charge in effective opioid management? And then I guess one of my other questions would be, is there a component of, I suppose, malpractice, so to speak, that also needs to be factored into this as well?
Good questions. The second one is much harder, so I'm going to put that off for a second. So the first one is, yeah, there are programs getting much better. It's very ad hoc, right? So a lot of this is a CME course gets some administrator at a hospital interested, and then they start moving things in their hospital system. But I've worked with a bunch of healthcare systems, and like you guys know doctors and nurses and nurse practitioners and PAs, like there are a bunch of people who want to do the right thing for patients and they feel like their hands are tied because the structure is so deeply, deeply broken. So you get the right people who will kind of militate, you know, with the higher ups and with the C-suite to try to make this sort of thing happen. There's also a lot of data production that's doing really important work, and so there's a team at Michigan that I always talk about called Michigan Open, and the leader there, Chad Brummett, has been putting out data for 7, 8, 10 years. Like, hey, we prescribed opioids for decades with zero evidence base. Like, we have no idea how many pain pills it actually took to like make somebody reasonably comfortable after a particular surgery. So we should probably get that evidence, right? So now we have this huge evidence base that's coming out. Pick up Science, pick up Journal of Internal Medicine, pick up New England Journal. Like, every other issue, there's something about like, oh, now we actually know how much we've been overprescribing for gallbladder surgery, right? So yes, things are getting better in this way. It's just so piecemeal, right? We don't have like a authoritarian system where they're like, medicine, do better. I'll just say one quick thing about the malpractice. I don't know that there's ever been a single successful malpractice suit for harming a patient by getting them off of opioids badly. That's one side of it, right? So I just got tortured just 8 years ago. I got tortured by the healthcare system. I was real angry because it felt like it was done to me. But like, no one's gonna get in trouble for that, right? They were getting me off of medication I needed to be off. And when I report it, it sounds like, yeah, that kind of sucked and there was something we can learn from this, right? But that's not gonna be a legal issue. Like, so there are patient advocacy groups right now who are actually trying to make some suits based on legacy patient mistreatment, so they get fired from clinics for not tapering fast enough or something like that. But I don't know of a single successful one so far. It's much more likely to be legal trouble on the other side, which is why there's this imbalance. Because if you prescribe opioids aggressively, even in a way that I would call responsible because you're not abandoning your patient, right? The Department of Justice might start looking at you because they can get access to that data, right? So if you're in Wisconsin, the State Department of Justice is watching PDMP data, the Prescription Drug Monitoring Program, to see who are the outlier prescribers. And that's a really chilling sort of thing for prescribers to be like, if I prescribe a bunch of meds to this guy who's not ready to taper yet, the Department of Justice might send me a letter, which they've done, right? Medical licensing boards do the same thing. So right now there's a very significant imbalance where there's not a ton of fear about getting in trouble if you abandon your patients. But there's a lot of fear about getting in trouble if you prescribe aggressively. And like, that's a bad incentive structure, right?
Just let everybody know, CME is continuing medical education, and for licensing, every physician needs to have a certain number of hours.
Thank you. Yeah, I try to remember to define my terms. Yeah, CME, continuing medical education.
Veronica.
Hi, thank you for the talk, flying out all the way to Dallas. My question is regarding a testimony from one of my undergrad who's working in a lab as an EMT as well. So he observed that a lot of people get addicted to prescribed opioids because they have a leftover opioids at home from a family member. And then this guy takes an opioid whenever the NSAIDs or Tylenol doesn't work for his migraine or something else. So in that case, increasing a public awareness about opioids is also important, but do you also think that having a better regulation of the opioid drugs is also important?
It's a really good question. My worry about it is that we already regulate these so tightly that that imbalance is a little bit in the direction of fear right now. So there is a lot of pressure to regulate opioids even more tightly. So state by state, I actually should have looked up the Texas state law just to be interesting for you all. But almost every state now has a set of rules, like for certain procedures, you can't get more than 3 days of opioids. For certain procedures, you can't get more than 7 days of opioids. You can't get over 50 morphine milligram equivalents without the doctor doing a prior authorization. And those are a pain in the neck. So it's a real disincentive to have a physician do very many of them, right? So those policies are already pushing against opioid use so aggressively in the sort of ways that I was talking about that I'm worried. It doesn't mean that there's not something else that we could do better, but I'm worried about further stigmatizing use of medication when that stigma can push people off and destabilize people in the way I described. So it's like obviously a really delicate balance, right?
Hi, thank you so much for a fantastic talk. I am a marriage and family therapist, so we're a little tertiary to all of this. Excuse me, but we do have very honest dialogues with clients, and so I wonder if we're kind of some people, catch maybe some of the story, and then how does our field support? How do we kind of integrate and see how we play a part in this as mental health professionals?
Oh man, I mean, such a huge role because one, like, drug use is so stigmatized that nobody wants to deal with it. So if you're in an adjacent field, if you're getting some catching and you're not going to turn them away, like you're already part of the solution. Like, come to me. Like, this is the team, right? But some of the folks are going to end up in your office because of issues related to drugs.
Right.
and getting them into the right system, because there are just so many barriers to actually listening to them and getting them taken seriously. To be clear, especially because you do family and marriage, it's really, really hard to love somebody with an addiction that is burning their life down. So like everyone in here who has loved somebody with an addiction, like I don't want to downplay that they can be hurting the people around them, right? And so you're also wrestling with this like secondary component piece. But if there is some work that you can do to help those people get into the system, you know, when it's opioids, like the gold standard right now should be if somebody is willing to think, to save my marriage, I could get inducted onto buprenorphine today. So buprenorphine is one of the gold standard drugs. It's an opioid agonist therapy, which means it goes in and meets the brain receptor that is targeted by opioids, and it sort of blocks it from the opioids that are more dangerous and risky because of their profile. So buprenorphine does offer some pain relief. It has some mild euphoric effects, but it has a ceiling effect on respiratory depression. So it's very, very hard to overdose from buprenorphine. So it makes it a very special drug. It's a really, really powerful tool. And it should probably just sort of be first line for people who are willing to try it. And so if you've got somebody who's like, to save my marriage, I will try something, induct them onto buprenorphine that day, right? And our system's just not set up that way. Like the number of places who can induct you onto buprenorphine the day you want help is like, you know, you can probably count on a few hands, so.
Okay. Is that, like, are those resources published anywhere, or is that something I'm just gonna have to dig up and put together?
Well, so the buprenorphine one is really quite easy nowadays, because it used to be that to prescribe buprenorphine you had to have an X waiver, and so this is a special DEA license, and they just got rid of the X waiver. And so now, you know, it's not a completely simple drug to use, so the person has to be in at least mild withdrawal before they can be inducted onto buprenorphine. So there's a sort of technical aspect of getting someone into this first step towards recovery. But like you can learn it. You know, there are CMEs offered everywhere. So unfortunately, probably it is a little bit of like, just a little bit of digging, but it's pretty easy. You don't have to do the X waiver anymore. There are a million CME courses.
Okay, thank you so much. That was really important.
You got it. Thank you.
I could also tell you, related to buprenorphine, that Nora Volko, who's the head of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, has been a huge proponent of this for a long time. And you can go to the NIDA website at NIH and find all kinds of resources related to that, as well as the underlying science that's mostly been funded by NIDA.
Yeah.
All right, one more question. All right, two more questions.
I'm from Baltimore, so obligatory go Ravens.
Yeah, go Ravens.
More to the point, if we have an overprescribing problem in this country, I wonder how much of that, and I wonder what your thoughts are on the role of our societal and cultural schema on pain, and how we see pain, and how we treat pain in this country as opposed to elsewhere. I asked the question, because I've heard it asked in the hospital setting a million times. What's your pain level? What's your pain level? And it, you know, there are correlates, I don't know the behind the scenes, but there's correlates with things like patient satisfaction scores and, you know, CMS involvement and all the, you know, all the organizations that oversee these things. And I know I read a paper some time ago about prescribing practices after common major orthopedic surgeries in America, and how much more likely patients are to walk home with an opioid script here as opposed to, I think it was Germany that I read. But I wonder how widespread that is.
Yeah, no, Germany is a common kind of counter case. So, got the slide here. I don't know if you'll be able to see everything. So, the attitudes about pain is just this really interesting piece. And so, here I talk about opioid attitudes, but they're tightly correlated, right? So this is a timeline. If it's small and you can't read it, I won't give you the whole spiel. I wrote a whole chapter based on this slide, or this slide's based on the whole chapter, because it's fascinating that basically for 150 years, we bounced back and forth between saying, you know, pain shouldn't be put up with, everyone should get access to the strongest painkillers we have, opioids, they're magic, and, oh, actually opioids kill everybody, they're evil black magic, nobody should get them. And so this starts in the mid-1800s. We isolate morphine from the poppy plant. We eventually synthesize heroin, and this is before regulation. There's no scheduling system. And so Heroin is advertised as the safe and effective alternative to morphine once morphine starts causing problems. So this is like America's first opioid epidemic is kicked off by morphine after the Civil War, tons of chronic pain among soldiers, heroin to try to solve the morphine problem, and we freak out. Like opioid epidemics make people freak out. And so we get Hamilton Wright is the country's first drug czar, appointed under Teddy Roosevelt, and he starts this swing back. You might have heard of the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act because it still sort of lives in interesting different ways in our legislation. So it's tied to, for instance, why you have to have methadone clinics to distribute methadone, because we say you can't use heroin to treat morphine addiction. Long historical story there. But we eventually outlaw heroin. It's like fun historical fact. Heroin's not special, just helped cause an epidemic, and so the lawmakers like, that one's bad. So we outlawed it, but heroin's fine. Like we could use it in medicines, like oxycodone, it's fine. I mean, it's fine, like in the way oxycodone is fine. I'm not giving you the hard sell on heroin here. But not using opioids is real bad for treating pain seriously, right? And so this lasts for the better part of half a century, and then we get folks come along thinking like, hey, this is real dark. I mean, modern medicine in the 20th century is advancing. We're keeping people alive longer. We're doing more surgery. People are living long enough to die more from like cancer and other really painful conditions. And so the palliative care field is born starting around the 60s and 70s. And this starts to swing that pendulum back a little bit towards, we've got to take pain seriously. Like, what kind of monsters are we? We're literally letting people die of end-stage cancer in incredible amounts of pain and withholding morphine from them, which we had access to. What kind of monsters are we? Take pain seriously. And then this real bad thing happened, which is that pharma jumped on the bandwagon. And so like, hey, all you people who want us to use more opioids, we'll pay you to say that, right? And so we get this really nasty sort of spiraling out of control. So we get physicians and clinicians are told pain is the fifth vital sign. Now every time you see a patient, you need to ask them about their heart rate and respiration, et cetera. You check those things and you ask them about your pain. And so we have to measure their pain. So we get that pain scale, right? We can't listen to their heart and get pain. We can't take their pulse. We can't take their respiration and get pain. So we ask them. And that's where the pain scale comes from. Pain is the fifth vital sign. There's a pill for every pain. We have to give it out. So now where are we? I got a question mark here. Are we back in the anti-opioid area? Because I started saying things like, I'm worried about how much we're stigmatizing opioids. I'm worried about the legacy patients, these patients who've been on really high doses for years or decades. I'm worried about them being kicked off. But to be clear, we're still over-prescribing for a bunch of like routine surgeries. If you got a kid who goes in for a routine dental extraction, this makes my head explode, but they might still be offered a bottle of Vicodin when they walk out. Despite the fact that we now have peer-reviewed literature that says for routine dental extraction, ibuprofen and acetaminophen, going on for a while, in combination are as effective as low-dose hydrocodone, which is an opioid, right? So like, we're still in this weird phase where a bunch of people are like giving out bottles of pills for bad reasons, and we're pushing chronic pain patients off their medicine. And so I don't know what era we're in right now, but I know it's a mess, right? And I want people to take pain really seriously and be empathetic humans. I also want us to prescribe opioids in an evidence-based way that doesn't drive addiction and overdose. So that was a really long answer to your question, but yeah, thanks for that.
All right. Well, we have about 10 to 15 minutes left for the reception outside, so I should walk up to the front. So let's first thank Travis for his terrific. And I'd like to encourage everybody to grab some refreshments, and also maybe you could go over to the posters where you could learn about some of the work that's happening here. A lot of it is centered around hopefully getting to the point where we can take people that are having the kind of surgeries that Travis had, or even potentially more severe types of polytrauma, where we can dramatically reduce the amount of opioids that they're exposed to by developing non-opioid, non-addicting pain medicines, which is really the major point of the research that we do here. So thank you all so much for coming. Let's give Travis one more round of applause. And enjoy the rest of the event.